The full moon shines in the sky, amidst a sprinkling of stars that glisten among the clouds. Amidst the darkness and towering, sprawling trees stands a young woman. Her abundant, lustrous locks, of rich auburn hue, beautifully shimmer in the light. In her iridescent ruby eyes, one can clearly discern sorrow. Playfully dancing over the outstretched palm of the young woman, the flames trace intriguing patterns. As the continent's sole witch, she has already lived for 3 centuries. With unimaginable power capable of obliterating a country in the blink of an eye, fear and worry have been absent from her life. However, her heart has been largely consumed by hatred. The girl harbors a genuine aversion towards all those she has ever encountered, even strangers. Her animosity is so intense that a mere glance from her would send shivers down anyone's spine. For this reason, she once withdrew to live in the mountains, where she remained for many years. Now, as her gaze falls upon a young man with short golden hair, looking at her imploringly, kneeling and shedding tears from his forest-green eyes, she finds herself contemplating that the centuries-old hatred in her soul is beginning to wane. Believing in his sincerity, she not only spared the young man's life, but eventually followed him to his kingdom. Holding the young man's hand, the witch couldn't help but wonder if she had simply decided to go with him. Indeed, the girl was constantly at the young man's side. She stood by him as they walked, stood beside him as he sat with a self-assured smile on his splendid throne. She was his pillar of support. She found herself embraced in his arms upon that throne. Yet, at the end of this seemingly joyous tale, there awaited only one outcome, a tragic and painful end. When blood trickled down the witch's chin, from which she coughed, a blood-stained sword flashed before her eyes. Lying on the floor of that magnificent castle, where she had spent so much time with the young man, the girl gazed into his empty eyes and listened as he pronounced her name, Irina, explaining that he was only fulfilling the word she had once spoken, foretelling that she would destroy everything standing in his path. So let her now perish by her own words. Wiping away the tears streaming down her cheeks, the girl realizes that, ironically, after becoming a witch, she would meet her end at the hands of the only person she had once confided in. However, fate smiled upon her, and her core of mana, her source, remained intact. Thus, Irina's soul could depart her body before its demise. Well then, in order to restore her powers and be reborn anew, she would need to remain in the realm of spirits for a decade. At least, that's what Irina believed. In one of the castle's rooms, where bright sunlight streams through the windows, a chambermaid, holding a small bundle with a baby, curiously asks another why the child is not crying. The girl responds that she doesn't know, as judging from the discontented expression on the infant's face, he seemed on the verge of bursting into tears. Irene couldn't believe her eyes. She had reincarnated into a newborn baby. Her hair was as white as snow, but her eyes remained the same as in her past life, crimson, aflame. Irene was astounded to see how a shapeless remnant of consciousness drifting in the spirit world could possess such strength to allow her immediate rebirth after her death. It was simply inconceivable in her understanding. The chambermaid, with her beautiful chestnut hair elegantly coiled and eyes resembling the color of a tranquil sea lagoon, anxiously inquired if she should spank the baby. The chambermaid was deeply concerned as the newborn infant, who should be crying at this time, remained silent. As Irene, now reincarnated in the body of the infant, still retaining her clarity of consciousness and memories, was placed on her stomach and gently patted on the back, she furiously and embarrassedly exclaimed in her thoughts that this was a degrading indignity for a worthy witch. What a shame! Nevertheless, even after the strike, the baby girl didn't shed a single tear, showing no reaction whatsoever. Then the second chambermaid with short dark hair suggested calling a doctor. However, her conversational partner stuttered and cried out for her not to do it, as if His Majesty found out, both of them would suffer dire consequences. In that case, he would immediately deem the girl useless and order her immediate removal from the palace. For this reason, they decided to slap the baby again. The girl, who understood every spoken word, tensed up. Would she have to endure this humiliation once more? Unwilling to endure such humiliation again, Irene decided it was time to start crying. Her scream echoed throughout the room, and the maids who heard it were overjoyed. A heavy burden seemed to lift off their shoulders. They immediately began examining the infant, relieved to find her in good health. However, Irene didn't share their joy. She still harbored hatred towards humans and mentally wished for these two individuals to remove their hands from her. How dare they lay their hands on a great witch's body? The gleaming chambermaid softly wished for their beautiful imperial princess to survive, emphatically emphasizing that she must not die under any circumstances. Hearing this, Irene couldn't comprehend the nonsensical babble they were uttering. Why on earth would she even contemplate dying? At that moment, she had no knowledge of her impending and mad future, unraveling before her very eyes. Though, even if she had known, she wouldn't have been able to change anything. Sunlit bunnies playfully hopped along the walls of the chamber. While lying in her cradle, Irene gazed at the hanging toys, shaped like golden stars, reminiscent of an entire galaxy. Now a little girl, she pondered why she had become a child. Her contemplations were interrupted by the fury of realization that it was all inconsequential, as it had happened due to the accursed illegitimate son named Lakas, who betrayed her. Lakas, the youngest prince of the Karelian kingdom, despised by his brothers and the crown prince, fell into an ambush set by hired assassins as he traversed the southern desert. The young man barely survived the crisis, followed by an escape. Eventually, he managed to crawl through Irene's mountain range and knelt before her, shedding tears. That very night, Irene felt as if she had been enchanted. In the human tongue, they call it love at first sight. Now she believes that's precisely what she experienced back then. And so, Irene surrendered her power and throne to him. One day, Lakas unexpectedly promised her a proposal, but the girl never received a ring. Instead, he pierced her body with a steel sword. As expected, one cannot trust people, and Irene deeply regrets going against her own convictions. However, it is all in the past now. Who could have known that after her death, she would be transmigrated into a child's body? Stretching her tiny hands towards the ceiling and observing them, Irene began to realize that she now had an excellent opportunity. The very best. For 10 years is far too long for a human, too long for a traitor like Lakas, and thanks to her transmigration into this body, she can seek vengeance upon him more swiftly. The realization of her ability to avenge such a vile person made her little eyes sparkle with joy and mild excitement. Her revenge would be swift and unimaginable. Wasn't that her initial motto? Holding the doll in her hands and gazing into its glassy eyes, filled with fury and indignation, Irene vowed that she would unquestionably slay Lakuza. At that moment, one of the maids approached her, the one with thick braided hair, pleading with the other girl not to inform the emperor, worried about the child's life and fate. Looking into the cradle, she noticed the baby girl was already awake. While the maid cooed over the child, Irene came to a slightly disappointed realization that she could not carry out her plans right away. She needed to mature first. Observing the girl, the maid inquired if the little one desired something delicious to eat. Seeing the baby shake her head, the maid understood she was not hungry yet. Then, the maid mentioned the need to change the baby's diaper, which sparked a torrent of displeasure in Irene, feeling indignant at the thought of someone carelessly touching her body. Unexpectedly, as the baby reacted to her words as if understanding their meaning, the maid widened her eyes in astonishment and asked if the baby understood her. Irene frowned in dissatisfaction, mentally exclaiming that, of course, she understood her. She was not as pitiful a creature as this girl. Witnessing this reaction, the maid smiled gently, though her eyes conveyed deep sorrow. She expressed that the princess was extraordinary, but honestly, she wished she were just an ordinary girl. Better yet, if no one knew of her existence. After all, ignorance about her was the only hope for the child to live a peaceful and long life. Irene found it rather strange how she delivered such profound words with such an expressive face. Looking at her sad countenance, the baby girl involuntarily pondered about the country she was born into, given that even the maid spoke something like that to her. The maid suddenly fell silent, realizing she had let slip something unnecessary in the presence of the princess. After a brief pause, she redirected the topic, laughing nervously, and promised to bring something delicious for the baby. Irene protested in rebellion, stating that she refused to eat anything distasteful. However, in reality, she could only make this protest in her mind. The door to the room swings open. Stepping out of it, the chambermaid announces that she will return shortly. Mentally, Irene only exclaims in annoyance that these insignificant individuals fail to grasp her words. Nevertheless, when left alone in the spacious, luminous chamber, she finds solace in silence and surrenders herself to contemplation. Once a witch, only one dared to challenge her. Now, confined within a feeble human form, she can only hope to find even a single star of mana within it. Folding her hands in a lock, the enchantress endeavors to concentrate and sense it. She closes her eyes and delves deep into her consciousness. Suddenly, she is illuminated. She can hardly believe her own sensations. How can 5 stars reside in such a tiny and frail body? Even in her past life, she was born with only 2. Could this body be that of a prodigy? This realization is most delightful. Smirking, she even contemplates attempting to conquer the entire world. However, despite setting an ambitious goal for herself, she currently has to contend with the life of a newborn baby who can neither walk nor speak properly. Enduring the maid's diapering with barely any dignity left, the witch is practically dying of embarrassment, especially while listening to the girl praise the princess for not crying at this moment. Having dressed the girl in a charming pink dress, the chambermaid, gazing out of the window, remarks on the delightful weather outside. She rhetorically asks if they should go for a walk. The girl adds that though they are safe here, no harm would come to them even outside. Contemplatively observing her servant, Irene wrinkles her nose in dissatisfaction. She does not understand her at all. At the moment, the witch doesn't even know which empire she is in. The only thing she knows is that she is a princess, but even that fact is uncertain. Yet, if that is indeed the case, who could possibly harm her? At that moment, the chambermaid, as if reading her thoughts, begins to explain aloud that this palace is called Dandelion. All princes and princesses of the empire are born here. However, there is a rule that prohibits princesses from leaving the palace until they turn 5. After reaching that age, girls must choose a sword and depart from home. Sighing with some relief, the maid adds that the princess's time for that is still far away. Until then, she promises to take care of her. At first, Irene gazes at her with mild astonishment and, to some extent, even admiration, as if she had not expected to hear such words. However, her surprise quickly dissipates, replaced by irritation, accompanied by gesticulations of her hands and feet. Irene is vexed that the chambermaid speaks of matters she utterly fails to comprehend. If only the witch could communicate, she would implore her to explain such moments more clearly. Noticing the child's suddenly spirited behavior, the chambermaid merely smiles. Observing the little one, she asks perplexedly what she might have done to incur the princess's wrath. In that moment, footsteps resound through the room, and a young man with long silvery white hair enters. The chambermaid could not fathom what had happened to her princess. She begins to examine the child, inquiring, more to herself than anyone, if the girl might be hungry. She even checks the diaper, which turns out to be dry. Because of this, the girl does not immediately hear someone entering the room. However, when she raises her eyes, astonishment and wild fear reflect on her face. She immediately bows and greets the emperor. Hearing the maid utter the word emperor, the girl on her arms immediately stops wriggling. Turning her head, she notices a tall, pale-faced man with long silvery white hair and gray-blue eyes. A small scar adorns his left cheek. Complementing his hair, he wears white garments with golden trim. The only elements that stand out against this backdrop are the dark blue wide belt and matching high boots. The thought crosses Irene's mind that he might be a magical swordsman. On closer inspection of his appearance, he appears rather familiar to her, at least in appearance, as though she has seen him somewhere before, but she cannot recall precisely where. In Irene's mind, a multitude of thoughts swirl, how ancient this person might be, whether he is even human, for the witch distinctly senses the aura of a dragon emanating from him. Instead of greetings or anything else, the emperor pronounced, gazing at the child, that the girl possessed lustrous tresses of white and eyes of crimson hue. The handmaid lowered her head and affirmed that the princess bore a striking resemblance to his majesty. Additionally, the handmaid remarked that the purest blood flowed through the princess's veins. Thus, when she looked at her, it seemed as though she beheld a vision of Eswin before her. These words deeply astonished Irene. In her mind, an image of a white dragon instantly ignited, extending its claw from which flames cascaded. Could they possibly be speaking of the northern dragon with whom she had an unresolved past life conflict? Why did they even bring him up at all? Upon hearing of the dragon, the emperor pensively stroked his chin. Once again, he glanced at the girl and proposed to verify the maid's assumption. When Irene saw the outstretched hand before her, her body seemed to freeze, overcome by cold and fear. When the emperor laid his hand on the young girl, a peculiar purplish-blue mist formed around his palm. Irene immediately felt an unimaginable, constraining pain coursing through her body. She couldn't comprehend what this man was doing to such a small child. Gazing at him and seeing a faint smile, Irene could only think of one word: dreadful. This man was dreadful. She burst into tears and attempted to bite the emperor. The maid promptly exclaimed and reproached her. The long-haired man was surprised, his eyes wide as he mumbled to himself, "Did she bite me?" The servant, observing the emperor examining his bitten hand, quickly tried to defend the girl, explaining that it was a misunderstanding and she did it because she was still very young. The girl began to plead for his mercy. Continuing to inspect his hand and the bite on it, the emperor concluded that he was facing a child who bites the enemy instead of crying out of helplessness. He shifted his serious, profound gaze to the princess and attentively scrutinized her face. At that moment, Irene also looked back at him, but her eyes were filled with anger. Though silently, she wondered what this fool was staring at. Once again extending his hand, the operator gazed contemplatively at the surrounding indigo-violet mist. With a smirk, he remarked how amusing it would be if the girl ended up choosing a sword for herself, if things continued in this manner. For the maid, those words sounded like thunder in clear skies. She instantly grew pale and stammered with a trembling voice that the princess was still very young, not even a year old. In response to her words, the emperor protested, stating that the princess had survived when he exerted his strength upon her. Irene, upon hearing this, mentally exclaimed that this man had lost his sanity. Misreading the emotions on her face, the emperor added that it seemed the idea appealed to the little girl herself. The maid, turning her head towards the child upon this remark, noticed the expression on her face and understood that the child was irritated and barely holding back tears. She silently added that she certainly didn't think the emperor was right. Unexpectedly, the emperor uttered the name Leoma. Shifting his gaze to the maid, he explained that he wished to bestow this name upon the princess. Still not averting his eyes from this wondrous child, as he saw her, the emperor began to ponder whether the princess would grow teeth like those of a lion, the king of beasts, or if they would resemble those of a wild magical creature. Leaning towards her before departing, he expressed a sincere hope that the girl would live up to his expectations. Irene, clenching her fists, sent him a dissatisfied, frowning gaze as a farewell. Having expressed his hopes, the emperor departs. The young girl, gazing after him, realizes that the art of conversing with children is clearly not his forte. Now, she regards him as merely eccentric. At that moment, the chambermaid attentively observes the child and sighs. The girl recollects seeing those scabbards somewhere before, which belonged to the emperor. She contemplates where exactly that might have been. Suddenly, enlightenment dawns upon her. The scabbards made from the horns of a dragon slain by a human hand. The sword hilt, crafted from the wings of the Queen of Fairies, also fallen by human hands. This simply cannot be. She remembers the emperor's eyes, cold, intense blue with pupils resembling those of wild beasts, and tries to convince herself that it couldn't have been him for sure. Her fists clench as she starts to tremble slightly. Trying to calm herself, she endeavors to remind herself that it is better not to dwell on past events and not to think about him at all, adding to herself that these must be mere objects bearing a striking resemblance to each other. The handmaiden gazes affectionately upon the princess and somberly avers that the latter must have endured immense pain. She tenders her apologies to the young girl and assures her that she shall promptly summon her physician. The handmaiden's eyes brim with sorrow and regret. The maiden, in turn, laments that had she not decided to accompany the princess on this occasion, the morrow would not have necessitated her wielding a sword. Alas, due to the laws of this empire, she regrettably finds herself unable to offer any aid. Irene observes her intently and attentively listens to the maiden's words. With bitterness, the handmaiden declares that the princess shall now be compelled to partake in the battle for the throne's inheritance. Irene fails to comprehend the subject matter at hand, the sword, the battle for the throne's inheritance. She remains oblivious. Suddenly, a revelation descends upon her, and Irene cannot help but rejoice. A shiver runs down her spine. If her assumptions are accurate, out of all the existing empires, only one demands such a throne struggle. In such a case, the emperor is, without a doubt, whom she had imagined. The power emitting the essence of a dragon, the white hair, the azure eyes. Undoubtedly, it is him. At this very moment, as if confirming Irene's suspicions, the chambermaid proclaims that the princess is now known as Liana von Hessis. This revelation is enough to throw Irene into horror. She shuts her eyes as the handmaiden implores the girl to remember this. In an instant, the head of the witch is flooded with thoughts that from now on, she is the daughter of the one who had repeatedly attempted to kill her. This discovery shocks her to the core. The ruler of the Hessis Empire is a being who has inherited the blood of a dragon, a colossal white dragon with mighty wings, long sharp fangs, and crimson eyes. She is the daughter of the one who clashed with her over 20 years ago. Back then, groups of merchants decided to traverse the mountains without her permission. Naturally, as a fierce witch fiercely defending her territories, she slew them all. However, those merchants not only hailed from the mightiest empire, but also belonged to the ruling lineage. It would have been well and good if it had ended peacefully, but that time they were transporting national treasures. So, what happened next? Ah, yes, the deranged emperor, whom Irene saw a couple of minutes ago, now being Liana, attacked the witch that night, attempting to kill her and seek revenge for her actions with his merchants. He charged at her with a sword in hand. Now, the young girl was revisiting all these memories with horror. If she had not cast aside her pride and fled, transforming into a mouse, she was uncertain her soul would have survived. Escaping from him, she understood that if he caught her, he would immediately kill her, not granting even the slightest chance of salvation. Since that incident, she had not been able to sleep a single night without thoughts of the Hessis Empire. Just imagine, she had been reborn as the daughter of that vile man. When recently referred to as Liana, the witch could no longer contain her indignation, anger, and panic. She let out a scream. The chambermaid, taken aback, first startled at the cry, then grew bewildered by the princess's sudden fury. At that moment, Liana pondered how unfortunate her recent times had been. Having learned all this yesterday, she already wished to abandon this body. Her desire was driven by the apprehension that if Emperor Hessis were to discover Irene's presence, even in the guise of his daughter, she would not be able to withstand his onslaught for long, and undoubtedly such an encounter would occur. Furthermore, inhabiting a body with a 5-star mana reservoir is utterly enchanting. Likewise, the blood within it, so why not remain in it as long as possible? Only the strongest are permitted to live. This is the principle by which all rulers of the Hessis Empire are nurtured. The former emperor claimed to have 38 children. You may ask, why so many? He compelled them to battle one another until only one victor, the mightiest heir, remained. He calmly observed as his children slew each other, not even flinching at their blood spilling upon him. The final survivor among his offspring ascended to the position of the new emperor. Hence, the deranged Emperor Hessis, her current father, killed 37 of his own siblings to secure power. Nevertheless, despite all this, Liana comprehends that she cannot capitulate and retreat at this moment. Recalling how she was slain in her past life, she realizes that she was born in lives in a realm where only the most adaptable survive. It is a world where people kill one another. However, such a task would be inconsequential to the most potent witch, that is to say, herself. The realization brings her genuine and unfeigned delight. As she observes the girl begin to smile, the chambermaid cannot contain her adoration. The maid scoops Irene up in her arms. In this instant, the witch contemplates that regardless, Irene has now been reborn as the 12th princess of the empire, Liana Hessis, and cannot afford to lose in this battle. If one adheres to the traditions of the Hessis family, until the age of 5, she should have been in complete safety. living in this palace. However, due to this damned emperor already involving her in his schemes, she must depart sooner. Moreover, it astounds the witch that he did this to a child who has not yet learned to walk. Frankly speaking, the moment she encountered the emperor, she had a feeling that someone already desired her demise. Now, despite everything, she must attain power. Meanwhile, the chambermaid, cradling Liana in her arms, has emerged into the presence of a crowd. She stops on the staircase, adorned with a crimson carpet, and stands before the multitude of people. In that moment, Liana smiles and immerses herself in contemplation as to which sword she should choose. When the maid appears with the princess in her arms at the grand hall of the palace, where a large gathering of people has assembled, Leonie observes that there are precisely over 100 individuals in the room. Her mind is incessantly preoccupied with the notion that she must seize the throne and thereafter abolish the cruel rules reigning in this accursed realm, which seem to be permeated with the blood of imperial family members. In her imagination, she already envisions herself as the queen, enthroned and reveling in her might. Leonie resolves that once she accomplishes all that she plans, she can contemplate world conquest, wielding this powerful body into which fate has inadvertently thrown her. Having seated the princess on the throne, the maid curtsies before her, addressing her as Your Highness, and requests her to choose a sword. Surveying all those present with a discerning gaze, Leonie scrutinizes the face of each person now standing in a row before her. The princess comprehends that the expression "choose a sword" undoubtedly does not pertain to a literal sense. As a member of the imperial family, she must select the one who will become her hands and feet, the one who will be her shield. In the crowd, she notices a person who immediately sparks her interest. She extends her index finger in their direction and mumbles something in her childish language, still incomprehensible to anyone, as if implying that her choice has been made. Leonie understands that, despite the substantial variety of personalities gathered here, she can only choose one person. And so, her choice falls upon a young woman of medium stature with dark gray hair. Her long bangs partially obscure her face, seemingly yearning to fall over her eyes. The young woman is clad in brown attire and a grayish-blue cloak. Meanwhile, standing near the window, a young man with dark green, somewhat swamp-colored hair and violet eyes, dressed in a crimson-blue jacket, smirks upon witnessing the princess's selection. Imagine that, she chose this very woman. Now he realized that the emperor had not lied to him during their previous encounter. During the previous night, when this young man conversed with the emperor in his chambers, upon hearing what the emperor disclosed, he glanced at him with a tinge of surprise, as if doubting his own ears, and inquired whether the man had truly seen the 12th princess of the empire. Seeing from the expression on his face that the emperor was telling the truth, he asked the man again, this time with even more astonishment, why he had escorted her to meet the princess, mentally noting that it was certainly not like him. The emperor, who was sitting wearily in his chair at that moment with his eyes closed, propping his chin with his hand, fell into deep thought. He did not offer any answer to the young man's inquiries. Lost in his thoughts, the young man then surmised that the emperor had likely seen the girl while visiting the Dandelion Palace. Nevertheless, he finds it difficult to believe. Could it be that he did this to ascertain what kind of child she was? Never receiving any response from the emperor, the young man posed new questions. What was the princess like? And is she worth much expectation? Instead of answering even one of the questions, the emperor finally opened his eyes and made only one request, for the young man to watch over the princess. Upon hearing such a demand, the young man was taken aback. Commencing an analysis of this peculiarity in his mind, he involuntarily recollected that the emperor had once requested him to devote himself to the first prince of the empire, who was already hailed as a genius at that time, while disregarding the second prince, who appeared rather unremarkable in comparison to his elder sibling, despite wielding unique ice magic. The fourth prince, blessed with the power of the sun god, and the sixth princess, possessing the magic of darkness, were deemed utterly futile by the emperor. Amidst all these contemplations, the young man became even more entangled. Now he is tormented by the question of what it is about the princess, who has not even come of age yet, that prompted the emperor to shower her with such attention, and even commanded the young man to take charge of her protection. Now, standing in the hall and observing which sword the girl chose, the young man smiles and reminds himself that it was precisely because of this girl that he canceled his meeting with the second prince. Evidently without the slightest regret, the young man is still unable to regain composure. Once again, he repeats that he can't help but think the princess indeed chose this woman. Upon gazing at the child's smiling face, he arrives at the conclusion that the princess is quite charming and amiable. However, before fully analyzing the thoughts that accidentally crossed his mind, he immediately panics and suppresses such notions. Nevertheless, the young man still can't comprehend why this child is so endearing. Whenever the princess directs her gaze towards him and utters some inquisitive sounds, he fumbles to articulate a response and blushes lightly. He feels an instant desire to caress the baby's cheeks. The two young men standing nearby exchange bewildered and concerned glances towards their comrade, inquiring if he is all right. To be honest, only when he turns his gaze back to the enchanting little girl and notices her tender smile does the counselor's heart beat stronger, and he nearly swoons from such loveliness. The two young men standing beside him grow even more anxious and inquire with deep concern if everything is all right with him. At that moment, the princess frowns and makes a face expressing complete disgust, even pondering if the man might be unwell. In that moment, as they observe the collapsed young man, people shout for someone to bring a stretcher. When he is finally placed on one, his countenance exhibits pure delight. Observing the appearance of the young man, Leona realizes that she knows him. He is the emperor's advisor and finest knight, Reborn, the man who slew 5 orc colonies in half a day and earned the resounding moniker of the Knight of Ruin. He also fought against her in her past life when she was a witch. Reborn, in one of those days, foolishly decided to cross the mountains without her permission. As a consequence, she simply chastised him. Now, surveying the young man from head to toe, Leona comes to the conclusion that he has become significantly stronger since their last encounter. As it seems to her, people truly grow rapidly. However, she still does not understand what happened to him and why he smiled at her. Eventually, Leona resolves not to torment herself with such questions and arrives at the realization that it doesn't concern her at all. At the moment, she has far more important matters to attend to. For instance, the choice of her sword. The girl she has chosen is the most powerful necromancer on the continent, Reborn, a necromancer who raises the dead from their graves and harnesses their power in battles. Since she can bring the dead back to this world endlessly, she becomes a formidable and relentless adversary. So the witch, upon seeing her, immediately decided that she'd better be on her side. Rumors about her power even reached Leona during her past life, and that's despite the fact that the witch hardly ventured beyond the mountains. Based on the tales told about her, Cage can slay more than 20 wyverns and turn them into undead. It's worth noting that one wyvern alone is already quite formidable, to such an extent that even 5 mightiest knights would find it quite challenging to contend with it. The kingdom of Jock, which attempted to kill Cage, was completely annihilated the next morning. That's how the rumors about her spread. When Leona learned about her history when she was Irene, she immediately yearned to duel with her at least once. However, unfortunately, she couldn't accomplish that back then. Cage was in a similar situation. Since the girl never visited the city in her past life, she never had the chance to encounter this renowned necromancer. But now, they have finally met. To be honest, Leona would have never imagined that her luck would favor her so greatly. Now, the witch is entirely certain that Cage, whom she has already appointed as her sword, will protect her life. However, she is unaware of how a girl accustomed to battle will care for such a little child, which Leona currently embodies. In any case, the girl is delighted that she performed well in this initial trial. Seated in her room, Leona watches Cage approach her, beaming with happiness, and stretches out her hands to the young woman, implying that she wants to be held. Leona believes that with Cage by her side, any assassins will no longer be a concern. Nevertheless, when Cage sees the outstretched hands, she first appears surprised, then an inexplicable emotion, reminiscent of embarrassment, crosses her face. Though Leona is not entirely sure about that, whether flustered or shy, Cage withdraws from the girl. This surprises Leona. Why does her sword shy away from her so profoundly? After all, she hasn't done anything yet. Fluttering more intensely and louder, Leona reaches out again, moving her hands more vigorously. However, upon witnessing Cage's same reaction, she continues to look at her, wondering if the girl is injured somewhere, hence not taking her into her arms. This time, it infuriates the little girl. She starts to wave her hands fiercely, demanding to be picked up, more out of stubbornness than a desire to be played with. Mentally, she adds that she doesn't care even if the girl is currently unwell. What vexes her is that the girl so blatantly ignores her. Suddenly, Leona feels intense heat. The room they are in is sweltering, and considering the vigorous hand movements she just made, she is drenched in sweat. Moreover, the presence of her sword, Cage, has also drained her significantly. Seeing that the baby has stopped crying and is now wiping her forehead with her tiny hands, Cage approaches her with a touch of concern and takes her hand. However, she underestimates her strength and ends up hurting the little girl. Tears involuntarily well up in Leona's eyes due to the unexpected pain. This reaction slightly alarms Cage. She begins to think that the body sitting before her is too small and delicate. Leona, on the other hand, decides to wait until she grows up. At that moment, a maid approaches them. The same maid who has been looking after little Leona all this time. Looking at Cage, she inquires about what has happened. Gazing up at the maid, Leona notices a pleasant thought fleeting through her mind. Only Rin truly understands her. The girl even resolves to take back her recent words about the maid being utterly useless. Observing the seated child and noticing the teardrops in the corners of her eyes, the maid remarks that the princess seems to be in pain. At that moment, a masculine voice from behind asks why the princess didn't allow Cage to leave. In the doorway stands a gray-haired man with amber eyes and glasses on his face. Cage wordlessly pulls him closer to the princess by his tie. Leona, gazing surprised into the man's face, mumbles something in her indistinct language, resembling a question. In her mind, it sounds like, "Who are you?" The physician, as though reading her thoughts, slightly embarrassedly adjusts his tie, barbarously pulled towards Leona's bed, and uncertainly pronounces that he is Vel, the personal physician to Her Highness. This leaves Leona astonished. She wonders why he has come to her. The doctor, at that moment, scratches his temple in slight bewilderment, realizing that the situation appears strange to everyone, and explains that this girl, named Cage, is too modest and quiet. So instead of making any requests, she simply dragged him here to examine the princess. The man turns to Rin and asks if he can examine Princess Leona. The maid simply nods in response. Irritated by this, the princess mentally questions why the girl can't just read her thoughts. When the doctor finally takes Leona's hand, she comes to the conclusion that her maid is truly utterly useless, and no situation will make Leona take back her words. The examination begins. Hardly having touched Leona, the man abruptly withdraws his hands from her and exclaims that they urgently need to call a priest. Rin, frightened, immediately asks him what the matter is and what he's talking about. Vel explains to everyone in the room that the princess's mana is overflowing. Upon hearing this, Leona becomes stunned but quickly recovers. Panicking, she starts feeling her new body, but upon realizing that she feels absolutely fine, her panic subsides, and she turns to the doctor irritably, considering him a common charlatan. In the meantime, Vel, still anxious, pronounces that 5-star mana is accumulating within the princess's petite frame. Having previously thought the doctor was just a fraud, Leona changes her mind when she hears his last statement. She is amazed that the man could sense mana and recognize such a phenomenon. The doctor continues voicing his deductions, explaining that although he infused some of his mana into the princess, if they don't do something right now, her life will be in danger. The maid, tearful and agitated, brings her hands to her mouth and says that she now understands why the girl has been sweating so frequently lately. In Leona's mind, she casually mutters that it's only because the room is very hot, and besides, she is the Flame Witch, so it's not particularly surprising. Rin continues to fret, recalling the moment when the princess's shoulders began to ache intensely. Leona, perplexed, gazes at the girl, unable to speak, and responds in her own mind that last time her shoulders trembled only because she anticipated obtaining the throne and power. In turn, Rin laments that it must have been very painful for the princess, and later adds that the girl managed to endure the pain without shedding a tear. This greatly annoys Liana, that everyone is now speculating and pitying her when, in fact, it is entirely unnecessary. The maid, looking at the girl, asks how she can continue to smile despite her sufferings, and where such determination comes from in such a young frame. Leona, tired of these discussions, exclaims indignantly in her mind that she was simply born with this body. While Liana is getting increasingly agitated, Rin, unaware of the Harris's anger, turns to the physician and asks if it's possible that the princess received the blessing of the very Esquin. Agitatedly, Vel declares that he will immediately summon the priest. The princess couldn't stop lamenting that nobody understands her in this vast castle. Later, in a sunlit room, the girl with chestnut hair tells Cage that she still senses mana swirling around them, but now she is confident that the princess will be fine. The girl assumes that the princess is currently safe only because they were able to react quickly. Nevertheless, she still requests Cage to keep everything that happened a secret from others. With that, she takes her leave, adding that if they encounter any more problems, they must call her without hesitation, regardless of the time of day or night. Meanwhile, the princess enjoys a sound sleep. Observing the peacefully sleeping maiden, Cage involuntarily recalls a fragment from her own life. Back then, in the pitch darkness of the night, she looked up to the sky and beheld the emperor standing at the edge of a precipice, holding a massive sword in his hands. That night, he implored her to pledge her life, and without the slightest hesitation, she made the solemn vow. Now, gazing at the serene visage before her, she can't help but think that the princess, despite her tender age and still developing physique, possesses immense strength. Gently tapping her cheek, the young woman can't help but liken her to a little rabbit. It appears to her that the youthful princess of the empire is akin to a rabbit, unafraid and unyielding, destined to one day transform into a predator. In her slumber, the girl frowns discontentedly. Standing by her bedside, Cage makes a firm decision. She will protect her. On a sunny and bright day, there was a genuine commotion in the palace. Maidservants hurried back and forth, carrying various objects in their hands, fulfilling the many tasks assigned to them from all directions. Leonora, who observed them and listened to their conversations, couldn't help but notice how unusually bustling the courtyard was today. As far as she knew, she was supposed to leave the palace today. If everything had gone as usual, she would be here, in this palace, under protection until she turned 5 years old. However, by the emperor's order, she had entered the battle for the throne much earlier and now had to move to her own palace. Surveying the atmosphere around her, Leonora accidentally met the gaze of the chambermaid. Rin. Sadness, sorrow, and excitement were evident in her eyes. Sometimes, it even seemed as though Rin looked at the princess with a mix of concern and fear for her life. The young girl, of course, couldn't help but notice that this girl had been looking at her that way quite often lately, especially after the incident with her magic. Rin, who always protected the princess, worried about her departure more than anyone else. Leonora comes to the conclusion that it's better not to think about the chambermaid right now. After all, she now has Cage. Glancing at the girl standing to her left, Leonora starts to babble something in her own language with a radiant expression on her face and reaches out her little hands to her. However, upon seeing that her sword is once again moved away from her, the girl starts to frown. Leonora comes to the thought that Cage is rather peculiar. Every time she looks at the princess, she blushes and steps away as if trying to maintain a distance. In reality, despite Leonora's mistaken interpretations, Cage, at that very moment, looking at the little child, is once again thinking about how she resembles a rabbit. Nevertheless, Leonora, misinterpreting the meaning behind that attentive gaze, decides that the girl is simply scared of her smile. At this moment, Rin approaches her and inquires whether the princess is fatigued. The witch only contemplates with dissatisfaction that the chambermaid would do better to explain why Cage keeps recoiling from her, instead of asking such foolish questions. Unable to express all these words, she furrows her brows and points at Cage. Rin, in turn, looks in the direction indicated by the princess, seemingly puzzled, and asks what's there. She merely shrugs, and misunderstanding the princess's words slightly, states that they can't do anything, as they need more time to prepare the girl for her departure. Taking a rattle in her hands, Rin suggests the princess play with it to pass the time. The princess starts crying out loudly, inwardly resenting that the great witch has no need for such things. Slightly startled by this reaction, Rin immediately apologizes. After a moment of thought, she decides to look at the other toys that lay in the box, and her gaze falls on a small white rabbit with one detached ear. She picks it up and brings it to the princess. As she looks at the dirty, tattered rabbit in terrible condition, Leonora realizes that it was simply thrown away. When the princess examines the toy, she notes to herself that it is quite an unusual rabbit. Observing such a reaction, the chambermaid thinks the girl is displeased with the toy and informs her that it's slightly worn and she already intends to take it away. Unexpectedly, however, the witch takes it from her and hugs it to herself, feeling flustered and inwardly disapproving that it is now her toy. Rin is astonished that the rabbit has captured the princess's heart so deeply. Meanwhile, holding the plush toy in her hands, Leonora understands that she doesn't know why, but she senses a dark mana emanating from it, and this cannot but please her. If she is correct, then holding the toy close to her for a long time should certainly transfer some of the mana to her. Leonora already possesses a 5-star mana, but she desires to become much stronger, so having such an object near her is opportune. Rin, observing the girl, who affectionately clings to the plush toy, can't help but be touched. As the girl falls asleep, Cage leans closer to the chambermaid and asks, subtly alluding to the toy, what it is. Rin explains that Her Highness's mother once purchased this rabbit for herself in the Duchy of Aslan. At that time, the Empress used to play with it all day long for many years when she was very young. She bought the toy when she joined the imperial family. Who would have known that the princess would also take a liking to this rabbit? Later, wiping away a tear, Rin adds how she wishes the princess could see her mother. In this moment, Cage supposes that the Empress has most likely passed away. With a sorrowful countenance, Rin inquires of Cage whether she does not feel compassion for Her Highness Princess Leonora, for she is at the very age when one should receive parental love and care, yet she lacks both. The girl is so young, yet already entangled in the battle for the throne. Cage responds that she feels no pity for the princess, as she is young and strong. The chambermaid protests, stating that the girl may indeed grow stronger later when she matures a bit, but currently she is still very frail. Cage fervently declares her desire to protect the princess. In this moment, she gently strokes the girl's cheek, noting to herself how soft she is. Sincerely, Rin thanks Cage for her spoken words and the decision made. As darkness falls heavily, the two of them step out onto the street. They walk along the dimly lit path, lined with large dark crimson rosebuds. Cage, surveying her surroundings and holding a lantern, remarks on how unimaginably eerie the palace of the Dark Rose appears. Holding the child in her arms, Rin replies that it is indeed a rather ominous place, especially considering the rumors that claim the palace is haunted by the ghosts of deceased members of the imperial family. Upon hearing this, Cage exclaims in surprise, asking how one could send a young child to such a place. She also inquires why this specific location was chosen. Although Leonora comfortably rests in Rin's arms, she can hear everything they say, and though she can distinguish the words, she still cannot comprehend why these two young women fear what they are whispering to each other. Cage is indignant that Leonora was sent to such a dreadful place and proclaims that she will report everything to the Emperor immediately, as it is highly unjust for the child. At that moment, Rin becomes highly agitated and exclaims loudly, anticipating Cage's actions, that, in truth, it was she herself who requested that the princess be sent to this very palace. Initially, Cage is stunned and falls silent, but then she exclaims loudly, wondering if the chambermaid has gone mad. Directing the hand holding the lantern, Cage, as she surveys the emerging silhouette of the mansion before them, declares that this palace is worse than garbage. A disconcerted Rin responds that it was the last wish of the princess's mother. Before her demise, she persistently implored Rin to ensure the girl's arrival there. Now, feeling uneasy about it, Rin apologizes to the young lady and explains that she simply had no choice. She could not disobey the late Empress's final wish. After a moment of silence, she adds that she is also greatly displeased by the situation, but she gave her word to the child's mother that she would protect her. Now, comprehending the reason behind such a decision, Cage composes herself and, with a slightly crooked smile, pronounces that this is a splendid palace and they will surely like it. While surveying her surroundings in that moment, the persistent princess earnestly tries to better discern the landscape and ponders that she wishes to learn more about this palace as quickly as possible. Continuing on her path, the chambermaid also extends her apologies to Her Highness Princess Leona. She speaks of how she has pondered over these matters many times, yet has not found the strength to refuse the girl's mother's final dying wish. The young woman vows that if this endeavor yields no fruit, she will certainly approach His Majesty again with a request to relocate them to another estate. The chambermaid implores her princess to endure a little while longer. Observing their frightened faces, Princess Leona shifts her gaze between them with bewilderment, wondering what is amiss with this ill-fated place that has them so agitated and apologetic. Eventually drawing nearer to it, Leona perceives that even in the pitch-black darkness, she can certainly discern its grandeur. As she casts her eyes over the edifice, she privately admits to herself that this immense structure indeed resembles a sanctuary for phantoms, and she wouldn't be surprised if it truly turned out to be one. The girl even muses that her mother was quite an eccentric individual. Otherwise, why would her dying wish be to send the princess to such a place? Suddenly, her eyes catch something rather peculiar, and she is greatly astonished by it. Leona silently notes to herself how intriguing this discovery is. She witnesses the same mana emanating from her rabbit doll, which surprisingly envelops the entire palace. This revelation emboldens the girl, and she starts to fidget, implying her eagerness to enter the palace as soon as possible. However, due to her inability to speak, all that escapes her are inarticulate sounds. Rin is taken aback by the child's behavior. Nevertheless, they are still far from the gate. The closer they get to the palace, the more mana they feel. Now Leona, unable to contain her excitement, wonders what secrets lie within this palace. Speaking of mana, when Leona contemplates it, she realizes that if she can sense it, then Cage, even more so, must handle it with finesse. However, as she scrutinizes the necromancer knight, she notices that for some reason the girl appears unchanged, just as she always does. This slightly surprises Leona and prompts her to contemplate. She is more than certain that since Cage is much stronger than her now, she should feel mana several times more intensely than Leona, but her face displays no interest whatsoever. Suddenly, a strong wind begins to blow. The princess, with evident astonishment, realizes that even in the wind, mana can be sensed. The chambermaid, slightly agitated, asks Cage what it was, but after looking at the girl, she observes that she remains completely calm at that moment. Turning their heads, they notice a little boy running towards them. He has golden hair and crimson eyes, draped in a white jacket on his thin shoulders. He stops in front of them, gazing perplexedly at the girl whom Rin is holding in her arms. After a brief silence, he frowns and declares that this child will die, even if he doesn't intentionally kill her. The boy looks indignant and wonders if he will have to fight for the throne against this little human. Noticing the penetrating gaze of the boy, Leonie becomes curious herself about the identity of this mini-emperor standing before her. She thinks indignantly that it doesn't matter who she is or how she appears right now. Although in the body of a weak infant, why does this little scoundrel dare to mock her so shamelessly? Annoyed by this, the girl starts speaking fervently, trying to drive him away. But the boy, not understanding her uttered sounds, becomes interested in what she just said and asks Rin and Cage about it in dissatisfaction. Incensed, Leonie begins to murmur more threateningly, hinting with her constrained utterances that the boy will fail in their struggle. The witch exclaims passionately that if only he allowed her to grow a little, he would witness how she would slaughter creatures like him in droves. The astonished boy looks at the child who is now vigorously moving her arms, obviously expressing anger, and for a moment, he freezes, saying nothing. If one observes his facial expression closely, it might even appear slightly contemplative. His gaze shifts to the princess's hands, noticing a small toy rabbit held within them. However, now briefly interrupting the narration and returning to some other events, it's worth specifying something truly interesting. A few days earlier, Harriet, a visitor, approached the emperor and anxiously inquired if all that was happening was indeed his doing. The man then looked at him in response, slightly puzzled, and adjusting his glasses, asked what his advisor was talking about. Harriet gazes at the emperor, lips tightly compressed. He trembles noticeably, but mustering his resolve, decides never to show his fear under any circumstances. He stands rooted to the spot, continually repeating to himself that he is not afraid of the emperor, as if trying to convince himself of this fact. Gaining courage, the knight advisor exclaims in astonishment, asking if the emperor has not heard the rumors spreading among his own servants. Harriet narrates that it is known that Princess Leonie has an excess of mana. The knight advisor conveys that people in the palace are constantly discussing the fact that she possesses 5-star mana. This news truly impresses the emperor. The young lad adds that nothing threatens the girl at the moment because Cage acted swiftly and went to the priest. But the princess's life is still in danger. With a satisfied smirk, the emperor realizes that Cage must have employed the necromancer's cell. As a man, he had already assumed this, so he is not even surprised. The knight, not understanding such a reaction, indignantly asks the emperor why he is laughing when the situation is serious and the princess could die at any moment. Resting his chin on his hand and wearily closing his eyes, the emperor inquires with displeasure what all this commotion from the knight is about. The trembling that overtakes the knight advisor when he feels the piercing gaze of the icy eyes makes it impossible for the man to concentrate. Nevertheless, he mutters under his breath that he wishes the emperor would do something about it. Locking his hands together, the emperor states that there is no need for that because, for him, it is a commonplace matter to kill the child with his own hands. He adds a little later that since the princess has already undergone the sword selection ceremony, her life is no longer under his control and entirely depends on her and her siblings. This response astonishes Harriet, and he exclaims indignantly, asking why the emperor refuses to protect this sweet and lonely princess and instead condemns her to death. The emperor arches an eyebrow with puzzlement and asks his advisor if Harriet now intends to say that he should defend the princess. Harriet promptly responds, stating that the imperial palace is a place filled with scoundrels, and this princess is very charming and delicate. Slightly embarrassed, but not losing the tone of indignation in his voice, the knight advisor inquires if the emperor has not seen her lovely countenance. How then could he wish to send her to fight for the throne? The emperor only scoffs at this remark. Later, he informs Harry that he sent the princess to the Dark Rose Palace. These words hit the man like thunder. No longer concerned about the volume of his voice, the knight exclaims indignantly that the emperor is well aware of what kind of place it is. It was in that very palace that the previous first prince of the empire gathered all those who refused to fight for the throne, and then mercilessly slaughtered them without exception. The walls and furniture of that palace still bear the blood of those unfortunate victims. Moreover, apart from its grim and tragic history, it is also far away from the main palace, increasing the likelihood that someone might send an assassin there to the skies. Still awestruck by the news of where the princess has been sent to live, Harriet, without any hesitation, strikes the emperor's table with her hands and tells him that His Majesty is simply a dreadful person. The man even wonders what he would do if the princess were to die. The emperor, once again perplexed, gazes at his secretary and speaks as if it were something so obvious that the princess's death would only mean it is her destiny. Harriet, covering her mouth with her hand, responds to this statement, asserting that the emperor is very cruel. When his advisor utters these words, for a fleeting moment, the emperor's expression becomes somber. However, after that, the expression quickly vanishes from his face, and he resumes talking to Harriet as if nothing had happened. The emperor confides in his advisor that when he first arrived here, he doubted his piercing gaze, which made everyone who ever met him fearful, except, apparently, Harriet. With tears in her eyes, Harriet childishly inquires whether the emperor thinks there might be an advisor better than him. Nonetheless, quickly changing her mood and summoning all her strength, wiping the tears from her eyes, the knight resolutely heads toward the door, stating that he has made up his mind. He will personally protect the princess. After Harriet and the emperor finalize their discussion, and the disgruntled knight advisor leaves the room, slamming the door, This scene is observed by the very same boy whom Leoma encountered on her way to the Dark Rose Palace. The emperor, left alone in his room, mumbles to himself that Cade, and now even Harriet, are all entangled with the 12th princess of the empire, who hasn't even turned a year old yet. Relaxed and smiling, he adds that it is quite intriguing. At the same time, the boy standing behind the door of his father's study is puzzled about which princess is being discussed and why she has captured the interest of not only Harriet, but even His Majesty. Nevertheless, he decides that if that's the case, he must see her for himself. If it turns out that she is unworthy of his attention, he will immediately dispose of her. Once again, that's what he thought back then. Now, returning to the events unfolding at the gates of the Dark Rose Palace, the boy gazes at this little, somber child clutching a rabbit to her chest, and his cheeks are betrayed by a blush. He cannot take his eyes off her, and he becomes intrigued by this small and adorable being. When the young lad catches sight of this petite damsel, his heart quickens its pace with each beat. He can scarcely begin to depict the extent of her loveliness. The boy continues to gaze upon her until he is interrupted by Cage, who inquires of His Highness what business he may have in this place. The lad glances irritably at the girl and grumbles, questioning whether he is only allowed to visit this palace for specific reasons. With annoyance and audacity, he also asks the young lady what if he came to this palace without any particular purpose. Cage's gaze is filled with doubts, and she does not attempt to conceal it. She requests His Highness to simply tell the truth, as she believes he is likely lying at the moment. The boy, in a state of anger, demands to know who else here is a deceitful individual. Unperturbed, Cage, with a stony countenance, responds that it is indeed he, His Highness, who habitually lies. Upon hearing the petulant words, "When was that?" the girl thinks with irritation that this prince stands out immensely due to his impertinence. Having calmed down, the boy's gaze returns to Leoma, who comfortably rests in Rin's arms, looking back at him. When his gaze once again falls upon the toy, he abruptly changes the topic of conversation, asking what happened to it. The toy does indeed appear quite worn, prompting him to express his discontent to Rin and Cage, remarking that even if the princess is still very young, they should not give her such trash. He later commands them to dispose of the rabbit and provide the girl with a new high-quality toy. A complete picture starts to form in the boy's mind. He envisions himself presenting the princess with a fine toy in his hands, and how much joy she will derive from it. Naturally, he will not miss the chance to announce that he acquired a brand new teddy bear, crafted from the finest materials for her. However, his fantasies are abruptly interrupted by Rin's voice, explaining to the prince that this toy was a gift from the late princess, and the girl cannot simply part with it since she has grown deeply attached to the rabbit. This news startles the prince, and all his fantasies crumble into harsh reality. With bewilderment in his eyes, he exclaims that he had heard the girl is still very little. Rin confirms his words, adding that the young princess hasn't even reached her first year yet. The boy then inquires whether she truly understands such matters at her age. The servant merely nods in response, accompanied by a somewhat awkward smile. At this moment, the prince experiences a disquieting sensation. The girl appeared so petite and defenseless that he immediately felt inclined to pity her. Uninhibitedly, he utters these musings, closing his eyes. Cage nods in agreement at that moment, affirming her complete concurrence with the prince's words. Now already irritated due to the emergence of such emotions, which are entirely uncharacteristic for him, especially towards a rival for the throne, the young lad rebukes Cage, ordering her to be silent. He then turns sharply to Princess Leoma, summoning her with a bold "you." The girl, not expecting to be addressed, looks surprisedly at the prince and emits a peculiar sound, somewhat resembling a questioning "me." Gazing at Leoma, the prince suddenly becomes somewhat melancholic and entreats her to cease evoking his compassion. He gently extends his hand, which emanates a pleasant, softly yellow glow with bright sparkles. This luminous glow, carrying its shining sparkles, immediately envelops Leoma, enveloping her in its warmth. The girl looks at the boy, her crimson eyes wide with astonishment. With a smile on his face, the prince explains that what she has just witnessed is the blessing of the sun god and beseeches the girl to accept his gifts with generosity. Leona is taken aback when the sun god is unexpectedly mentioned in the conversation. She continues to gaze and wonder at the boy until Rin, noticing her interest, hastens to explain to the princess that this person is her elder brother, Prince Nikhil. The girl further adds that he possesses the blessing of the sun god and can wield its powers. Upon hearing this, the girl chuckles sweetly and extends her palm towards Prince Nikhil's hand. Despite his initial arrogance and pride, the boy looks at the princess with a mixture of concern and incomprehension. Studying her face, he ponders, are all children so endearing? He cannot recall being like that himself, nor does he think he ever appeared as charming at such a tender age as Leona does now. Nevertheless, he brushes away these unpleasant thoughts and, abruptly turning around, heads towards the exit, leaving with a parting command, lending his voice a touch of solemnity, that he will return. As he departs, he orders the gates not to be closed. Even as Nikhil vanishes from Cage and Rin's sight, they continue to watch in the direction he went for some time, remaining cautious. Cage turns to the servant, stating that the gates should indeed be closed. Rin wholeheartedly agrees with her. Examining her palm, Leona involuntarily contemplates. Reflecting on their encounter, she feels that her elder brother endowed her with the blessing of accelerated growth. In the mind of the sorceress, the thought arises that these blessings are quite pleasing. However, she still dislikes those who behave like the young boy, too impudent and arrogant. Leonora already harbors hatred for people, but especially for such bothersome individuals like the young boy. She firmly believes that it would be for the best if these people never appeared at all. Fortunately, the suffering of the newborn child quickly passes, and now, unnoticed by many, time flies by. 3 whole years have passed since Irina received her new body and new name. Leonora, already a 3-year-old princess, sitting on the bed in a lavish yellow-white dress and touching her snow-white curly hair, which barely reaches her shoulders, she cannot contain her joy in finally being able to move her own hands and feet as she desires. With happiness in her eyes, she realizes that she no longer needs to lie in a baby's crib since she can now walk and even speak, albeit with the charming mispronunciation typical of children. To be honest, tears of joy well up in her eyes due to this delightful realization. With a relieved sigh, a somewhat amusingly melancholic thought crosses Leonora's mind. How could her life as the greatest sorceress have transformed into what it is now? However, smiling, she remembers that since she is only 3 years old now, it means she is still growing. While the girl indulges in her reflections, Rin enters the room. Seeing the princess, she, as usual, breaks into a smile and inquires if the little girl has already awakened. Leonora stands up from the bed and, with some letters left unpronounced, joyfully responds that she woke up a long time ago. Then the maid says she will bring breakfast to the room, but only after washing the little girl. As Leonora answers that she is indeed hungry, Rin, listening to the child's speech, can't help but think of how adorable she is. She simply freezes and gazes at her with a peculiar expression on her face. Noticing that glance, Leona wonders what happened to Rin and whether she is in any pain. The maid replies that she is perfectly fine. The reason for that look is simply because the princess is stunningly magnificent. The little girl responds, knowing this well, as Rin kindly reminds her of it every minute. If anyone among those around them should inquire about the disappearance of the Emperor's allure, Leona responds that all of it has been transferred to the 12th princess of the empire, who resembles a man in every aspect. With a slight sense of self-satisfaction, Leona still thinks to herself that, compared to the years when she was the witch Irene, this is merely a drop in the ocean. Chuckling at the child's reaction to her words, Rin sits down on her knees in front of the girl and suggests that she needs to wash her. Seizing the chance to play with the girl, Rin proceeds to wash her. Observing the young woman, Leona contemplates that Rin, like every other day, is exceptionally kind. At some point, a thought even crosses her mind, wondering if she could confide in her, at least to some extent. However, Leona quickly dismisses it to a far corner, recalling that no, she cannot. She has not forgotten her bitter experience from her past life. People always betray one another, just like Lekis did once. Leona reminds herself that the reason the maid is so sincere and affectionate towards her is solely because the girl is but a weak and defenseless 3-year-old child, not because Rin harbors any sympathy or tender feelings towards her. Rin inquires of the princess how she fared in her rest the preceding night, and whether she had pleasant dreams. Leona responds that she slumbered exceedingly well, even experiencing a joyful reverie. With a smile, Rin inquires about the content of the princess's delightful dream. The girl, seemingly gratified in some peculiar manner, reveals that in her slumber, her father passed away multiple times. Sensing that her face is no longer being gently wiped, Leona opens her eyes. She encounters an anxious gaze from the girl and notices how her hands tremble greatly. Frankly, while gazing at the girl's countenance, Leona genuinely cannot fathom why she has darkened so profoundly. Nevertheless, immediately grasping the cause, the girl, with a slight stutter, pronounces that he, her father, will not truly perish, for Rin knows him well. Satisfied with her clarification and attempt to console, she smiles. However, upon examining her handmaiden once again, she comprehends that the girl has only grown even more somber. Rin places her hand to her lips, unable to divert her gaze from Leona. Unaware of the actual matter at hand, Leona contemplates whether Rin truly believes all this to be real. The chambermaid abruptly stands, placing her hands on her hips. She gazes at the girl discontentedly and somewhat indignantly. This leaves Leona even more perplexed. Unexpectedly, Rin, with a loud cry, requests Lady Cage's counsel. Lady Cage, who had been standing near the room's window from the outside, evidently unprepared for such a piercing cry, becomes startled. Rin approaches the door leading into the princess's chamber. Leaning over the threshold, she asks the girl to come inside and informs her that they need to converse a bit. Cage, still not comprehending the matter at hand, looks at the chambermaid and responds that, in her opinion, it is unnecessary. Surprised, Rin inquires again, questioning if she refuses. Without waiting for an answer, she adds that she earnestly beseeches her and assures her that this conversation will not take much time. Eventually, they enter the room. Cage, still taken aback and somewhat indecisive, stands next to Rin, who seems to be burning with anger. As they look at them, Leona sits on the bed in complete bewilderment. Cage gazes at the princess, her expression betraying a mix of excitement at being in the same room with the child and apprehension about the purpose of her invitation. Leona is bewildered as to why the girl gazes at her so indignantly. She is convinced that the girl came here, thinking she would go unnoticed. But it has been 3 whole years, and she can now effortlessly control her aura. Eavesdropping is now remarkably easy. These thoughts do not escape Leona without a hint of self-satisfaction. Rin interrupts her contemplations, speaking with displeasure, urging Cage to finally pay attention to what she says when in the presence of the princess. After all, Rin herself had reminded her countless times to mind her language. The girl turns towards Cage and continues to express that she doesn't care about the circumstances in that situation, but she cannot comprehend why Cage exposed the princess to such macabre entities. Rin explains that at such a tender age, the princess should be surrounded by nothing but benevolent things and joyous laughter. She is outraged that Cage subjected her to such horrors. Without intending to cease her moralizing discourse, Rin proclaims that now, because of this, the girl is haunted by such dreadful nightmares. Moreover, she narrates them nonchalantly, seemingly oblivious to how terrifying her words are. Listening to their conversation, Leona contemplates whether the undead truly are frightening. According to her own judgment, there are things far more dreadful, and the Emperor serves as a living example of that. Recalling the Emperor, Leona notes that she hasn't seen him in the Dark Rose Palace for 3 whole years. Rin never asked him to come to them. And since she has already started thinking about him, curiosity takes hold of her. If 3 years ago Leona couldn't even fathom competing with the Emperor in strength, does it not imply that over such a lengthy period, he must have become even more formidable? Leona's objective is to become the Empress in this empire, and for that, she must eliminate all her siblings. According to local customs, she can even take the Emperor's life. However, at present, she is unsure whether she can accomplish this feat. Engrossed in her thoughts, the girl momentarily forgets that Rin is still rebuking Cage. Returning to reality, Leona hears her chambermaid telling Cage that if she hears or sees anything similar again, she will experience her wrath. She asks if the girl understands, and Cage mumbles, slightly flustered, that Rin is already quite angry at the moment. Upon hearing this, Rin exclaims indignantly that she is not angry right now. However, quickly regaining her composure, she presses her hand to her cheek in astonishment and states that they do not have time to quarrel, as the princess is hungry, and they need to bring her food quickly. Cage adds that she is hungry too. In response, the chambermaid says that in that case, they should go together since the tray is small enough to accommodate 2 servings. As assassinations are a common occurrence in the imperial family, it is quite perilous for any member to stray far from their sword. However, Cage is, first and foremost, a skilled dark magician. Thanks to her, assassins cannot easily infiltrate her room, as her barrier is composed of her own necromantic power. Indeed, this is confirmed when Leona glances towards the window and notices a man hiding behind the sprawling branches of a tall tree. He is dressed in dark attire, his face concealed by a mask, and a small scar adorns his hand. Leona surmises that he is likely a hired assassin. Considering that he takes no action to enter the room and exploit the fact that there is no one inside except the princess, she realizes that he must be unable to breach the barrier. Hence, he wanders back and forth in frustration. Nevertheless, Leona wonders what he intends to do. At that moment, the hired assassin, who is observing the princess, notices that her sword has moved away from her. However, he is not entirely sure how to enter the room. While he ponders his next course of action, he realizes that the girl has stepped out onto the balcony and is gazing directly at him. The lad rejoices in his good fortune, thinking that the princess could have remained alive if she had not foolishly ventured out of her chambers and into his clutches. He even asks the child if she had not considered this. In response to his statement, the girl remains silent and continues to watch him. Gazing at her countenance, he observes that she is as lovely as people had described. At this moment, Leona approaches closer to the balcony railing and inquires of the hired assassin whether he is strong. The lad replies without batting an eye that indeed, he is exceedingly powerful, so much so that he could kill her before the girl even blinks. Leona smirks thoughtfully, and after a brief pause, retorts that if he truly possesses the strength he boasts of, then she will deal with him quite effortlessly. These words already have an effect on the assassin, and he is slightly taken aback. He is about to ask a question when the girl unexpectedly launches an attack with an ice sphere. Extending her hand towards the assassin, a patterned indigo-violet glow emanates from Leona's palm, covering the lad's legs with ice. Caught off guard, he neither has time to react nor evade. As he watches his extremities being encased in ice, the lad anxiously inquires about what this is. Leona, with a hint of mild displeasure, scrutinizes her hand, reflecting that if she still possessed her true powers from the past, she could have dispatched him in the blink of an eye. Nonetheless, she decides that all is not lost for her. While the hired assassin is still recovering from the previous attack, she immediately directs a sparkling bolt of lightning towards him. A sharp and loud cry escapes the lad. Gazing at the shocked expression on the boy before her, he begins to tremble and wheeze. Leona looks at him with a satisfied and malevolent expression. Though she deems it futile to expend her 3-star magic on such a pitiful assassin, on the other hand, she cannot recall when she last felt such joy. Nevertheless, she employs magic once more and heals the lad's wounds. As an almost imperceptible greenish smoke envelops him, he looks at his hand in astonishment, realizing how quickly his injuries have mended. Wide-eyed and gazing up at the princess, the lad asks if she has shown him mercy. Observing this person before her, Leona contemplates that people are indeed cunning. They belittle you when they feel you are weaker than them and unable to resist, and they praise you when they recognize that you are stronger, fearing that very strength. Smiling and snapping her fingers, Leona replies that it is not quite so. She has not shown him mercy, but rather does not wish to let him die too easily. At that moment, another surge of electricity courses through his body. The lad's eyes fill with wild fear. He implores her to stop, yet all that Leona can think about is that her behavior now finally resembles her true self. Leona reclines in her chamber upon a divan, basking in the pleasant rays of the sun. She comprehends quite lucidly that such tranquility invites her into slumber. Turning on her pillow, she caresses the delightful fabric with her hand. One might ponder if her intense desire for sleep stems from the divan's exceedingly luxurious softness. Rin had mentioned that the material she is currently touching is called velvet. However, it is neither present in the realm of Karelia nor within the Witch's Mountains, leaving her uncertain. Yet Leona concludes that her contentment arises from the divan's extreme comfort. She understands that now is not the time to relax, for Cage stands beside her, never averting his gaze. Nevertheless, it is precisely because of this that the young girl decides that all will be well. The young lady will remain at her side throughout the day. Besides, in such a situation, Leona surely cannot engage in the practice of mana manipulation. At that very moment, a mischievous notion crosses her mind. Perhaps Cage deserves to witness the true extent of a princess's magical prowess. However, upon observing Cage's change of countenance and witnessing the succession of emotions playing out on the princess's face, Leona determines, closing her eyes, that allowing a 3-year-old child to wield jewel-hued magic would yield no favorable outcome. Most likely, the girl's extraordinary power would attract attention, leading to the gathering of formidable adversaries intent on eliminating a formidable rival. Likewise, it is evident that Lacuse, the so-called ignorant bastard, as she refers to him, would become more vigilant once he learned of her abilities. The news would certainly agitate him, and he would likely venture into the domain of the Hashish Empire. Therefore, Leona resolves that the best course of action in this situation is to conceal the fact that she possesses witchery, at least until she gains mastery over the latent mana within her own being, and if enough time elapses until that moment, she is confident she will be able to subjugate the entire imperial dynasty. With this, she decides to take a brief respite. Nestling more comfortably on the divan, Leona attempts to drift into slumber with a smile. As her eyes close and she succumbs to sleep, various thoughts still occupy her mind. To her, slumber is truly a thing of beauty. However, she still cannot drift into a wondrous slumber. The door to the room unexpectedly swings open, and with a loud exclamation, "Hey, rabbit!" Nickel rushes toward her. For some unclear reason to Leona, the boy smiles brightly. Rising from the bed and casting a disapproving glance at her elder brother, Leona can't help but harbor thoughts of how she is never left in peace, not even for a moment. Noticing that the girl fails to react to his presence, Nickel somewhat vexedly suggests that when her elder brother visits her, she should at least say, "Greetings." Arching an eyebrow, Leona can't fathom what might be amiss with this lad. She still begrudgingly extends her greeting with a scowl on her face. In truth, Nickel has been coming to visit her almost every day for these 3 years. He is now 10 years old. Yet, honestly speaking, she has no idea why the one who is supposed to vie for the throne against her simply visits her as if they were old friends, or at least a normal family. Letting out a slightly heavy sigh, Leona disappointingly contemplates when he will finally come to face her for a duel. Raising an eyebrow with a hint of hesitation, Nickel stammers a question about who taught the little girl such a facial expression. Seeing his hands reaching out to her, Leona immediately wonders why Nickel is doing this. An unpleasant realization strikes her. Darn, he wants to pinch her cheeks again. Frowning even more than before, Leona curses her helplessness as a weak 3-year-old child who can't do anything right now. However, Cage, perhaps sensing the girl's unwillingness to be touched, either from her own insights or her own motives, intervenes and halts Nickel, reminding the prince that he should wash his hands first. The little prince inadvertently turns toward the girl and retorts indignantly that he does it gently and it doesn't hurt the child. He then adds that even if he were to accidentally hurt the princess, he could instantly heal her, for he possesses powers bestowed upon him by the sun god himself. Once again, with a blissful expression upon his countenance, he turns to the young girl and continues their play. At this moment, still vexed, the princess hears the words suggesting that she can be healed if wounded, and in her thoughts, she exclaims, "Does this lad truly believe that I would trust the words of such an unscrupulous individual?" In principle, her patience wanes. She unexpectedly slaps Nickel's hand, casually brushing his hand off her shoulder. The princess rises from the divan and sternly interrogates the boy about his actions. Taken aback by her response, the prince gazes at her, eyes wide open. After a brief moment of silence, confused, he utters a curt, "Ha!" Leon, no longer suppressing her anger, places her hands on her hips and once again inquires why Nickel acts in such a manner. She adds that he comes to her room every day and does as he pleases. The boy does not entirely grasp this sudden shift in mood, as he thought the girl enjoyed playing with him. Moreover, he becomes uncomfortable with these peculiar questions. Nikhil, looking perplexedly at the girl, states that of course he does all of this because he likes the princess. Now, even Leon did not anticipate such a response. She gazes at the prince, clearly puzzled. It is certainly not the answer she was hoping for. In that very moment, standing next to the children, Cage places her hand on her heart and with an enthusiastic expression exclaims that she also loves the girl. The prince reacts quickly and slightly nervously but loudly, as if competing with the girl, declares that he also loves Leon. A dispute ensues between them, which from an outside perspective appears rather comical. Sternly eyeing the boy, Cage declares that her love for the princess far surpasses his. Nikhil approaches Cage and, pointing his finger at her angrily, implores her to cease this childish behavior. Unbeknownst to them, engrossed in their discussion, Leon is not only surprised but also touched by some rather painful memories. She listlessly sinks onto the divan, gazing into the void, seemingly unaware of anyone around her or of the fervent and loud argument taking place. Instantly, her face reflects sorrow and disappointment as she realizes that once again she recalls that which she would most like to forget forever. Long ago, more than 3 centuries past, in a city adorned with numerous stone edifices, we would encounter there the cause of Leona's sorrow, or, to be more precise, Irene's. In the distant past, over 300 years ago, when she was an ordinary individual, still a young child with scrapes and clad in tattered soiled garments, she was discovered by a man hitherto unknown to her. He donned splendid, resplendent attire, with spectacles perched upon his nose and his long hair neatly tied in a ponytail. As the young girl would later come to know, he was a wandering alchemist named Jin. Their initial encounter transpired within one of the alleyways. At that moment, upon noticing the girl, he appraised her from head to toe with a look of concern and inquired whether she was entirely alone here. By then, darkness had begun to descend. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a gentle rosy hue upon the entire city and its every thoroughfare. At that time, she did not even know who her parents were. She was entirely alone, an ordinary child destined to perish on the streets. The man once more anxiously surveyed the frail girl, observing just how emaciated she appeared, and offered her a sandwich while asking how long she had been wandering here in utter solitude. This man was the first adult to show her kindness, and not only did he provide food and drink, but what astonished her even more was that he asked for nothing in return, and so, unbeknownst to her, she became dependent on him. She was only 5 years old then. On that evening, she took his hand, and together with him, she departed those cold, dreary, desolate streets. Having covered a short distance, they decided to pause in one of the narrow alleyways. In a corner filled with various wooden crates and barrels, they chose to take a respite and sit down, allowing the girl to partake of her meal properly. Then Jin inquired if she had a name. In a kindly manner, he added that he could not forever refer to her as child. Noticing her silence and the peculiar look she gave him, the man realized she probably had no name and proceeded to suggest choosing one for her. Fallen into silence, he slightly turned away, propping his chin with his hand, and pondered for a moment. Eventually, he bestowed upon her the name Irina. Gazing at the girl sitting next to him, who had patiently waited all this while, he smiled and remarked that the name suited her excellently, signifying that though she was still a young child, she could no longer be broken. Following that, she mulled over the name given to her and felt a sense of fulfillment in her heart. It was a warm and pleasant sensation. Unable to contain her joy, the girl broke into a contented smile and peacefully finished her sandwich. On the very same day, when she shared this pleasant and warm feeling with Jin, he simply smiled and affectionately patted her head. amused by her sincere confession and gently caressing her head. Jin stated that this warmth was none other than love. The girl's sentiment towards him could be called love, and naturally, he deeply loved her as well. Then, now known as Irina, the girl believed in the man's words. She believed that he genuinely loved her. Thus, she took Jin's hand and went to live with him in his tower, nestled amidst vast, luxuriant trees. Regrettably, back then, Irina had no knowledge of the trials that lay ahead of her. Behind the rusty grill, akin to a prison cell, sit several young girls. All of them are clad in soiled, tattered garments, bearing numerous wounds on their bodies, haphazardly wrapped in bandages, seemingly untouched by any prior treatment to prevent infection. One of the girls stands, gripping the iron bars with all her strength, imploring to be rescued. She calls out for a professor, earnestly beseeching him to set her free. Beside her, two feeble girls sit, seemingly unable to muster any strength to fight for their lives. Without even bothering to turn around to the pitifully wailing girl, Jin, without so much as a glance in her direction, proclaims that he did not expect her to still be alive. He urges two young men standing nearby to dispose of this refuse, deeming her useless. Without hesitation, they carry out his command. Irina observed this scene with a newfound horror. She stood there, pale and her body trembling with fear. As it later transpired, Jin had infused demonic powers into these people, turning them into living weapons. Countless children had met their demise thanks to him, imprisoned in these cells for his sinister schemes. Despite the sea of corpses, he did not relent, evidently still believing in the success that awaited him. With a felicitous smile adorning his countenance, he turned to the young girl, seemingly oblivious to the extent of her fright, and gently pressed his palm against her cheek. Then, he beseeched her to listen attentively. The man declared that he discerned hidden potential in Irene. Examining the girl once more, now more diligently observing every detail, he remarked upon her crimson eyes and matching tresses. Gazing at her with eyes alight with happiness, he joyfully proclaimed that such hues in her appearance could only signify one thing: an abundance of magical power within her. Jin inquired whether the girl was unaware that demons originally possessed such features. The girl looked at him, her body paralyzed by horror and fear. It seemed as though, for a moment, she had lost the gift of speech. Jin, whether disregarding these emotions or perhaps because of them, endeavored to speak with the girl as tenderly and affectionately as possible. On that day, he asked her to work with him, encouraging and flattering her, expressing his belief that she would undoubtedly succeed, thus nudging her towards granting her consent. Now, Irene realizes that she should have declined his offer and escaped from this alarming place as swiftly as possible. However, at that time, she was incapable of doing so. The girl was so afraid of being forsaken by him that the notion of victory never even crossed her mind. Gazing into his frenzied eyes, Irene listened to his equally unhinged discourse. He spoke of how she could come to terms with it all, for she loved him. Later, he added the most repugnant words she had ever heard from such a deceitful person. He declared his love for her, and now she was irrevocably ensnared. Over time, even as her flesh began to decay from the infused blood of magical creatures, and even as demonic mana kept her on the brink of death, she desperately believed that Jin loved her. Despite the cries and lamentations, she endured the pain again and again. Even lying on the bloodied floor, completely battered and weakened, she silently persisted through these tormenting ordeals. In the end, she finally comprehended her mistake. It happened on that fateful day when Jin gazed at her with immense disappointment in his eyes and pronounced her a dreadfully useless entity. Those forsaken words wounded her more deeply than all the trials she had endured at such a tender age. She looked at the man and could not fathom why he uttered such dreadful words. Had he not professed his love for her? Jin continued to shout in indignation and irritation, while Irene, upon hearing that first sentence, sat in a state of trance. Her entire world, which she saw solely in the face of one man, had just crumbled before her eyes. Amidst the professor's ongoing shouting and his complaints about how challenging it was to please children, and now, by the devil, he would have to do it all over again, Irene's hands simply hung limp, like a speechless puppet. She realized that everything she had lived for was a lie. At that very moment, she realized that everything had been a falsehood, The professor ordered her disposal, casting her away, stating she was no longer of any use to him. This brought her out of some trance, and with fear in her eyes, she looked at the professor. Then, something seemed to click in her mind, and all memories of that day abruptly ceased. When she finally regained consciousness, the tower lay in ruins, and all the people who had been inside were dead. She sat amidst the debris of the building, surveying her surroundings. The sky on that day was filled with black clouds, and a heavy downpour ensued. It was then that she understood Jin's experiment had succeeded. 3 years had passed since she arrived at the tower. She was already 8 years old at that time. As she regained consciousness and examined her hands, she suddenly realized she had grown into adulthood. Her body had completely changed. Despite the lingering shock, she remembered how the professor had told her that if the experiment succeeded, he would call her the witch. With a smile on his face and enthusiasm in his eyes, he had proclaimed that she would become the world's only witch. She would be incredibly unique. With sadness and weariness in her eyes, paying no attention to the tears rolling down her cheeks, ignoring the cold and the rain, she scrutinized her hands, realizing that, at least according to the professor's words, none of this uniqueness mattered to her at all. Sitting amidst the ruins, surrounded by pools of blood, the person who claimed to love her had been lying. And with this realization came the second one. There was not a single person who truly loved her. Finally, she rose on trembling legs. She ran away from that tower. She fled from those memories where the only person she had trusted had so brazenly lied about loving her. As she ran through the forest, her mind was consumed by the thought that from people who lie as though they speak the truth, she would finally depart and never return to them again. Thus, she lived for about 300 years in complete solitude, residing in the mountains, far away from people who offered her nothing but falsehood, betrayal, and pain. Amidst these somber and disheartening memories, which deeply troubled her heart, she was suddenly jolted by a voice that resonated nearby. As she opened her eyes and scanned the room with her gaze, she seemed to recall just now that she was still in this luminous chamber of the palace. Before her stood Cage and Nikhil. Their faces displayed unmistakable concern for the girl. Leonora finally realized that it was their voices, sounding close by, that had pulled her out of that trance-like state. Gathering herself, brushing her bangs from her face, and taking a heavy breath, she came to the realization that she had been lost in her thoughts too deeply. Her elder brother, the young Prince Nikhil, asked with a touch of worry if she was all right, for she appeared to be perspiring heavily. Cage, too, took notice of this and suggested that the princess might be feeling cold, urging them to summon a doctor urgently. Nikhil nervously remarked that the girl seemed more taken aback by her own appearance than genuinely unwell. Irritated by such remarks from the boy, Cage glared at him and muttered under her breath that it was the same thing. Later, she inquired whether His Highness had ever seen his own countenance. Likewise, turning towards the girl and baring his teeth, Nikhil almost began to growl at Cage when Leonora intervened, finally imploring them to cease their quarreling. The girl extended her hand, explaining that she was perfectly fine, and then sternly grumbled for them to remain quiet, even for just a moment. Hearing this, Nikhil couldn't contain his laughter. He smiled, murmured that he would stop arguing, and then covered his mouth with both hands before giving a cheerful chuckle. Leonora looked at him, confused, and pondered what was wrong with her elder brother, why he smiled when just a moment ago he had been insulted. She truly did not understand these people. Nevertheless, the girl decided to cast aside these musings and defiantly declared that they should never quarrel in her presence again. Cage and Nikhil stared at her, wide-eyed and amazed. The girl simply warned them that if she ever witnessed their bickering again, she would strike them. This finally silenced them. On the countenances of these two individuals, there appeared a peculiar and enigmatic expression. Unexpectedly, they moved away from her, towards opposite ends of the room, and began whispering animatedly to each other. Nikhil inquired of Cage whether Leonora's mother was deceased. In hushed tones, she proceeded to share with him what had occurred, according to the rumors she had heard. After listening to her, Nikhil came to the conclusion that the princess, it seemed, always lived together with a chambermaid. Leonora, who sat slightly farther away, could not discern the words and remained oblivious to their current conversation. She let out a tired sigh and wiped the sweat from her face. At that moment, the young Prince Nikhil approached her and, gently running his hand through her snowy hair, affectionately called her Bunny, a nickname that had been kindly coined by him on the day of their acquaintance. He expressed his intention to make her a promise. This slightly surprised the girl, but not as much as the boy's following words did. Nikhil, gazing at her with a serious countenance that did not betray any hint of falsehood or jest, vowed to always stand by her side. At that juncture, Cage, who stood near the couch on which Leonora sat, spoke up, stating that, like her sword, she, too, would always be on her side. The boy, who was accustomed to arguing with the girl, irritably muttered that she should leave. Then, with a bright smile on his face, he reached out to Leonora and promised to always protect his younger sister. Placing his palms on her cheeks, he stated that even when he becomes emperor, he will not harm Leonora, but will ensure that no one could ever lay a finger on her. Leonora looked at him with amazement and was unable to utter a word. Nikhil asked if she agreed with his promise, and Cage, who had also drawn closer to the girl, said she promised the same. Without removing his hands from her face, the young prince stated that now the princess had not just one but two people who were determined to defend her. Cage added that in the future, there would be even more such people. Nikhil agreed with the words of the sword and said that many people loved her deeply. Therefore, he entreated her to cease her melancholy. Despite all these pleasant words, wounded by past experiences of interacting with people, Leonora became even more sorrowful. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the fear of being abandoned, betrayed, and hurt again, a fear stronger than her faith in their truthful declarations. Seated before her on his knees, Nikhil, noticing her eyes becoming even more melancholic, suddenly declared his love for her. Cage, still standing behind her, also exclaimed her affection for the girl. With tears in her eyes, Leonora ultimately arrived at the mental conclusion that she would never trust people again. Leonora remained seated on the ill-fated couch in the room, but now Cage and Nikhil had taken their places beside her, one on each side. Her elder brother gently stroked her hair, while her swordplay instructor affectionately caressed her cheek. Their expressions displayed a mix of fondness and peculiar happiness. Leonora did not share these emotions. She sat there, feeling embarrassed and blushing, mostly enduring their presence and awaiting the moment they would finally leave her alone. At a certain point, when she could no longer bear it, she indignantly stood up and yelled at them to stop. She confronted them, raging in her mind, demanding that they no longer treat her like a child. In her thoughts, she resented them more and more, realizing that she was a great witch who had lived for over 300 years, while they were just patting her cheek and stroking her hair as if she were an ordinary toddler. With arms folded, she glared fiercely from one to the other. In that moment, she noticed Nikhil covering his face with his hand, and his shoulders began to shake. Misinterpreting this emotion, Leonora assumed he was clearly frightened. What an unworthy behavior for someone aspiring to be a great witch. Satisfied with herself, she regally closed her eyes and reclined back on the couch. Nevertheless, Cage looked at her with a slight smile on her face, while Nikhil burst into laughter. Observing his little sister's cheeks adorably puffed up with indignation, he teasingly called her Rabbit again and asked if she was truly upset. Nikhil could not contain his laughter, all the while remarking on how their little rabbit had grown into a remarkably independent young lady. Leona, with her cheeks puffed up and scowling, endured the mockery with her last vestiges of strength, refusing to open her eyes. She let out a displeased snort in response to such a statement. Observing this reaction, Cage became slightly concerned and looked at the girl. As Cage attempted to express to the prince that his actions had gone too far and were genuinely upsetting her, Nikhil glared at her disapprovingly, raised an eyebrow, and proclaimed that he couldn't get along with her at all, even if he tried, adding that he sincerely despised her. Suddenly, he stopped and fell silent. Leona also noticed that the mana in the air had changed. The entire room was now enveloped in a peculiar black mist, evidently emanating from the window. In defense, Cage stepped forward in front of the girl and extended her hand. A black-purple sphere formed in her palm, emanating patterns resembling lightning of the same color. Nikhil followed suit, creating something resembling a yellow-golden shield adorned with various ornaments and patterns, also positioning himself in front of Leona. Unexpectedly, a figure burst into the room. clad in dark garments, the person's face concealed beneath the hood of their cloak, and a long red scarf draped around their neck. This all happened so swiftly and abruptly that the young prince immediately turned to Leona, anxiously scanning her to inquire if she was injured. Cage, also alarmed for the princess, immediately turned to her and inquired if Her Highness was unharmed. Nikhil let out a relieved sigh and replied that their rabbit was perfectly fine. Caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the newcomer, Leona sat on the couch feeling slightly disconcerted. She felt awkward because someone had rushed to her defense for the first time. Blushing and flustered, she pondered over the strange emotion now spreading through her soul. In general, experiencing human emotions was quite challenging for her, let alone understanding them. It seemed evident to her now that the reason for this difficulty probably lay in the fact that she had been human a very long time ago. The girl had distanced herself from people early on and had ceased all communication with them, having fully embraced her identity as a witch. However, at the moment, observing Nikhil and Cage approaching the fallen figure on the floor, she decided it was best not to dwell on it. At least she had more important matters to attend to. The young prince, examining the unknown individual, wondered how they had met their demise. Turning to Cage, he expressed doubt and a hint of self-satisfaction, suggesting that the person had died because of him. Cage looked at the young prince discontentedly and muttered that she believed if the person had indeed died, it was definitely her doing. While they argued, a young man entered the room. He greeted everyone, mentioning that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Upon hearing a stranger's voice, they immediately turned in unison towards the door and beheld the entrance of Harriet into the room. Taunting Nikhil and Cage, he inquired how they intended to become proficient defenders of Leona with such a dreadful reaction. Sporting a smile on his countenance, Harriet confidently strolled closer to the couch where Leona sat, enduring the offensive gazes of the indignant young prince and the sword. Leona, not expecting his presence within the castle, wondered when he had managed to arrive here. Frowning and observing the young man, she realized that she couldn't even sense the flow of his mana, which was rather peculiar. It felt as though only a brief period had passed since she, as Irene in her past life, had struck him and he had wept at her feet. Now, gazing at him, she comprehended that he had grown significantly stronger. After this realization, Leona became even more dissatisfied with his visit. She sat there, consumed by her fury, and could only think about how irritated she was. Her mind was overwhelmed with the anxious thought that now she had to strive to grow even faster. Period had passed since she, as Irene in her past life, had struck him and he had wept at her feet. Now, gazing at him, she comprehended that he had grown significantly stronger. After this realization, Leona became even more dissatisfied with his visit. She sat there, consumed by her fury, and could only think about how irritated she was. Her mind was overwhelmed with the anxious thought that now she had to strive to grow even faster. Period had passed since she, as Irene in her past life, had struck him and he had wept at her feet. Now, gazing at him, she comprehended that he had grown significantly stronger. After this realization, Leona became even more dissatisfied with his visit. She sat there, consumed by her fury, and could only think about how irritated she was. Her mind was overwhelmed with the anxious thought that now she had to strive to grow even faster. Period had passed since she, as Irene in her past life, had struck him and he had wept at her feet. Now, gazing at him, she comprehended that he had grown significantly stronger. After this realization, Leona became even more dissatisfied with his visit. She sat there, consumed by her fury, and could only think about how irritated she was. Her mind was overwhelmed with the anxious thought that now she had to strive to grow even faster. Period had passed since she, as Irene in her past life, had struck him and he had wept at her feet. Now, Leona pondered that despite him being the emperor's advisor, he almost visited the palace every day whenever he had the opportunity. It would have been nice if he brought something along with him. But no, this scoundrel merely chattered and then departed. The most vexing part was that he always strolled around with a cheerful disposition and a wide smile on his face. Scoffing and turning away disdainfully, Leona repeatedly deemed him utterly useless in her mind. Noticing her reaction, Harriet covered his mouth with his hands. His eyes sparkled with a bright light, and he asked in astonishment if Her Highness was upset about something, completely oblivious to the fact that he himself was one of the reasons for her wretched mood. Upon hearing this, Leona's expression changed once more. She sighed heavily, paying no heed to his endearing exclamations, and remembered that he too lacked common sense. Harriet, as if not perceiving her discontent and slight irritation, continued to exclaim how adorable she was, even when she turned away from him in annoyance. At that moment, the princess tried to calm herself, and chanted the same phrase in her mind. "I don't hear, I don't hear." Ah, how she wished she could be among normal people right now. She once again concluded that she needed to grow up quickly. Harriet, it seems, is ready to marvel at every action of the princess. As he observes her displeased headshake, it leads him to think that Her Highness is truly adorable, even when performing such a simple gesture. In that moment, he abruptly regains his composure, remembering that it is not the time for endearment. Placing his hand on his chest, he speaks with great dignity, stating that he came today not merely to meet with the young princess, but to convey certain information to the prince. Now it's Nickel's turn to be astonished. He perplexedly points at himself, as if seeking clarification, asking, "To me?" Finally serious and focused, Harriet reveals that he knows the prince visits the Palace of Dark Roses every day. The night advisor, with feigned concern, inquires what the prince intends to do if others find out about it. The young prince, completely imperturbable, wears an expression of absolute calmness and replies that everyone is already aware of it, so he fails to comprehend what could be so bad about his daily visits to the palace. Harriet lets out a heavy and weary sigh. His facial expression takes on an air of condescension towards the young prince. He warns that if His Highness doesn't start watching his words and actions, his life may suddenly and abruptly come to an end. Tension, which unexpectedly escalated between Prince Nickel and the Imperial Night Advisor, Harriet, filled the entire room. Cage, as if watching a comedy, observed their dispute and unabashed disdain for each other with keen interest. Frankly, Leona has no idea why they detest each other so intensely, but from what she's heard, they both dislike the fact that each of them frequents the palace too often. Despite the sparks flying from their eyes, Leona still perceives that they value each other. Letting out a heavy sigh, she reaffirms that human emotions are too intricate for her understanding. Prince Nickel, with a disdainful smirk, remarks that Harriet is so old that he will die much sooner than him, as that is just how it works. Smiling, the knight retorts that he is not old, being only 30 years of age, and he desires to live a long and peaceful life. Arching his fair brow, Nickel replies that half of Harriet's life has already passed. Harriet, not to be outdone, declares that unlike the prince, he possesses life experience. Furthermore, the prince surely comprehends that this life experience gives Harriet a significant advantage over him. These words unsettle the young prince. He grits his teeth but falters slightly, not entirely sure how to respond. In this verbal duel, Nickel has ultimately lost. With a hint of indignation, Leona mentally notes that no matter how strong her elder brother is, at the age of 10, he cannot compete in strength with a man of 30. Finally coming to terms with his defeat in their verbal joust, Prince Nickel finally inquires about the message Harriet has brought him. He asks him to quickly state it, and then leave the palace. Harriet asks in surprise if the prince has not yet mentioned the purpose of his visit. At last, he conveys to the young prince that the day after tomorrow, there will be a ball in honor of the second prince's birthday. His Imperial Majesty has ordered all those who received an invitation to attend without fail. The news of the ball surprises Leona. Displeasedly sighing, Nickel inquires about the consequences if he refuses and chooses not to attend the ball. With a mournful countenance, Harriet replies that it cannot be so. The prince is obligated to be there, as everyone will be present at the birthday celebration. Nickel exclaims in surprise and asks if that means even this child will be there, implying Princess Leona with the phrase "this child." Covering his eyes, Harriet responds that of course not. Princess Leona is not among the invited guests. Hearing this, Nickel breathes a sigh of relief and remarks that it is simply splendid. Shortly after, Nickel asks if their father will be at the ball. Harriet is once again surprised by the question and inquires whether he did not mention that it is an order from His Imperial Majesty. With a sarcastic tone, he adds, seemingly questioning the young prince's memory, likening it to that of a fish. Significantly gliding his palm horizontally across his throat, the young prince demands to know how the knight dares to disrespect the imperial family and speak so rudely to him. He also promises that once he becomes the emperor, he will have Harriet killed, and therefore requests him to prepare for that eventuality. Mocking such a statement, Harriet leans closer to the princess and sarcastically remarks that he must run away, as that is precisely what Nickel implied, and also playfully asks Leona the same question. However, the young girl remains silent and turns her head away, not providing any response. Somewhat perplexed by this reaction, the knight murmurs in puzzlement and asks if Her Highness can at least give him her attention. In that moment, Leona contemplates that she doesn't even want to look at him. Nevertheless, when she glances at Nickel, she notices his deep concern. Tenderly calling him Nick, she grips his jacket with her fingers and pulls him closer, seeking his attention. Nickel turns to the princess and inquires what happened and why she is holding on to him so sweetly. With sparkling eyes, Leona playfully states that she also wants to attend the birthday celebration. In truth, she requests it, hoping that the entire imperial family, well, almost all of them, will be there. As one vying for the throne, she needs to see all her competitors and understand, in advance, what they are capable of. Thus, she cannot miss such an opportunity. However, Nickel is not pleased by the girl's desire, and neither is Cage. The young girl begins to look very worried, and Nickel becomes so somber that it seems he not only pales but also turns somewhat gray. The boy promptly approaches the girl and takes her hands in his grasp. His body shivers with a cold sweat. Though his voice trembles considerably, he manages to articulate that she should not do this, attempting to argue that the girl lacks an invitation. Leona casts sorrowful glances and suggests he could simply take her along. Growing even more anxious, the prince admits she is right. However, honestly, he can't fathom any reason not to bring her along. He merely looks at her, trembling, and incoherently mutters. Ultimately, he merely kneels before her and apologizes, stating that he cannot take the girl with him. Becoming even sadder, Leona inquires why he cannot do so. Harriet, who is evidently displeased with this idea as well, appears highly agitated. The man leans closer to the princess and endeavors to explain that the event is far too perilous for her. Therefore, he also believes it truly best for her not to attend. Nickel, forgetting his dislike for the man, affirms that the knight is absolutely correct. He adds that, furthermore, this second prince is utterly reckless and deranged. Hence, he believes such a young and charming child has no place at such a ghastly celebration. Cage also joins the conversation and agrees with the prince and the knight. Instead, she proposes they go on a picnic together. Prince Nickel immediately supports Cage's idea and asks if Leona agrees. He also promises to join them shortly. Biting her lower lip, Leona contemplates what kind of great witch she would be if she were to surrender now and miss such a crucial event for her. Before vanquishing her opponents, she needs to study them thoroughly, and she is well aware of this. Currently, quite a number of people protect her, and her enemies will find it rather challenging. They simply won't be able to harm the princess so easily. Therefore, under these circumstances, the perfect moment arises, one that could not have been chosen better. Leona, with a cunning smile, wonders whether Cage, Harriet, and Nickel all assume that she will simply remain idle in the palace while they solve problems. Nothing and no one will stop her just like that. Later, on an alley lined with tall verdant trees, Nickel looks back at the departing Harriet, who is already approaching the stairs, and calls out to him. The knight counselor immediately turns around and inquires about the matter. Nickel, concealing his hands behind his back, asks if he has a moment to spare. Not expecting the prince to initiate such a conversation, Harriet looks skeptically at the child and seeks clarification, as if not hearing correctly, whether Nickel wants to talk to him now. Later, he wonders how this is even possible. Annoyed that the man is laughing, the young prince irritably asserts that he is not joking. He genuinely wishes to discuss Leona and her future with him. Harriet responds that he doesn't quite comprehend what could happen to the princess, who is in the palace. Then Nickel explains that the girl told them not to say that they love her. Nickel reveals that she explained it by saying she detests such words. Surprised by this, the man inquired whether the princess could truly say something like that. However, he then adds that the princess is only 3 years old. But immediately, in contrast to his arguments, he ponders why she said it after all. Nikhil explains that he shared this with the man for one reason, because he cares deeply for his younger sister. Gazing at Harriet, he again assertively states that he will repeat it again and again, emphasizing that he speaks about all this solely for the benefit of the princess, not for Harriet's sake. Meanwhile, Harriet is indeed contemplating why the princess rejects love at such a young age. He speculates that perhaps something influenced her decision. The man knows she has never received parental love. Her mother is deceased, and her father is the instigator of a bloody battle among her own brothers and sisters. Therefore, Harriet concludes that something must be done about it. Nikhil then asks the man if they can try to tell everything to his mother. Perplexedly arching his brow, Harriet clarifies whether Nikhil means to tell it to the fourth empress. Nodding, Nikhil enthusiastically says yes, he can ask her to meet with Leona. Not understanding the prince's intentions, the man asks what his mother can do in this case. As if not noticing Harriet's lack of understanding, the prince joyfully expresses that he himself is unsure of what his mother might do in such a case, but he believes the girl will surely appeal to her. In his mind, he already envisions their first meeting, and his mother, the fourth empress, will think admiringly of how charming the princess is. Placing his hand on his forehead, Harriet wearily mumbles to himself, a question about what he will do with someone who sees the world through rose-colored glasses. Frowning, Nikhil asks indignantly what the knight mumbled, as he is certain that the knight did not praise him. Harriet explains that the expression he just used means that the prince is very foolish. Nikhil is angered by such audacity from his father's advisor. Nevertheless, paying no attention to it, the man continues to talk about how Nikhil must have completely forgotten that the princess is his enemy. Nikhil, slightly embarrassed, averts his gaze and says that he remembers it perfectly. Then Harriet asks in bewilderment why, if the prince remembers it, he visits Princess Leon every single day. Even ordinary socializing with her should already raise suspicions within the imperial family, as it violates the empire's laws. Harriet continues his speech, adding that in addition to everything else, the young prince also wants to introduce the princess to the fourth empress and tell her everything that is happening with the girl. Naively believing that she will warmly embrace the girl, he asks if Nikhil truly thinks that the empress will be delighted with Leon. Frankly, Harry cannot believe that this will be the case in real life. He thinks it would be remarkable if she simply spoke unfavorably about the princess rather than coming and killing her. This angers Nikhil. He is surrounded by a golden glow, and in fury, he shouts at Harriet not to dare insult his mother. Dodging the young prince's attack with a calm expression, Harriet says that in any case, the empress should not know anything. After calming down a bit, the prince finally asks what they should do then. Smiling kindly, the man replies that he will take care of everything himself. He will simply bestow some of his love upon the princess. To be more precise, so much love that she will be able to drown in it. These words disgust Nikhil, and he thinks that he simply cannot bear it. Ignoring the obvious feeling of disgust, Harriet continues to cry out about love in the name of the princess.